The radio crackled with static as Admiral Chester William Nimitz leaned forward in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, his weathered hands gripping the decoded intercept. The morning sun of May 27, 1942, cast long shadows across the war room where the fate of the Pacific would soon be decided. The Japanese were coming, and this time, they meant to finish what they had started 6 months earlier. Station Hypo, the Navy's top-secret code-breaking unit, had achieved the impossible. Commander Joseph John Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts had cracked the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code, revealing Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's audacious plan to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle at Midway. Toll. The intercepts painted a picture of overwhelming Japanese confidence. 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers were converging on the tiny coral atoll that served as America's westernmost outpost. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive account in History of United States, naval operations in World War II, the intelligence breakthrough at Pearl Harbor represented one of the war's most crucial turning points. Yamamoto's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. The combined fleet would split into multiple task forces, with Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's First Air Fleet spearheading the assault on Midway, while a separate force attacked the Aleutian Islands to the north. The diversionary strike was designed to draw American forces away from Midway, leaving the atoll vulnerable to invasion. Once Midway fell, Yamamoto believed the Americans would be forced to sue for peace rather than risk their remaining carriers in a hopeless fight. But Nimitz possessed something Yamamoto could not have anticipated: foreknowledge. The American admiral knew exactly when and where the enemy would strike. As he studied the disposition chart spread across his desk, Nimitz made a decision that would echo through history. Rather than retreat, he would concentrate his meager forces and meet the Japanese head-on at Midway. The odds were staggering. Against Yamamoto's 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, Nimitz could field only 3: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had limped back to Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea with a gaping hole in her flight deck. The Japanese possessed numerical superiority in every category: more ships, more planes, more experienced pilots who had honed their skills in the crucible of combat from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies. Yet Nimitz understood that in naval warfare, position often mattered more than numbers. He would position his carriers northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance flights, and wait for Nagumo to commit his forces to the attack on the atoll. Only then would the Americans reveal themselves, striking when the Japanese flight decks were cluttered with rearming aircraft. As the final week of May slipped away, both fleets began their fateful convergence on a patch of blue water that few Americans could even locate on a map. The Japanese sailed east with supreme confidence, their admirals already planning the victory parade through Tokyo Bay. The Americans sailed west with grim determination, knowing they carried the hopes of a nation still reeling from the disasters of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines. Neither side could have imagined that their meeting would last only 4 days, but reshape the entire course of the Pacific War. The pre-dawn darkness of June 3, 1942, shrouded the Pacific in an eerie calm as 2 mighty fleets moved inexorably toward their appointment with destiny. Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the bridge of Enterprise, felt the weight of command settle upon his shoulders like a lead cloak. Beside him, the seasoned carrier Hornet cut through the swells with purposeful grace, while to the south, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's Task Force 17, centered around the wounded but defiant Yorktown, maintained radio silence. The Japanese awakened that morning with the serene confidence of victors. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo reviewed his battle plans one final time as his carriers maintained their diamond formation 240 miles northwest of Midway. The morning reconnaissance flights had detected no American naval forces, confirming Yamamoto's intelligence that the Pacific Fleet remained scattered and demoralized. By sunset, Midway would fly the rising sun, and America's last toehold in the Central Pacific would belong to the Emperor. At 04:30 hours, The first wave of Japanese attackers thundered off the flight decks of the 4 carriers. 108 aircraft, Kate torpedo bombers, Val dive bombers, and Zero fighters, formed up in the gray twilight and set course for Midway. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the formation with practiced precision, his orders clear. Neutralize the American air defenses and prepare the way for invasion. The Americans on Midway had been expecting them. Radar operators had detected the incoming strike at 0553 hours, and within minutes, every serviceable aircraft on the atoll was clawing its way into the morning sky. Marine Fighter Squadron 221, flying obsolete Brewster, Buffalo fighters, met the Japanese formation head-on in a desperate battle that filled the sky with smoke and flame. The Marines fought with suicidal courage, but their antiquated aircraft were no match for the nimble Zeros. Naval historian Gordon Prange noted in Miracle at Midway that the heroic sacrifice of the Marine pilots bought precious time for Midway's anti-aircraft defenses to prepare for the onslaught. By 0630 hours, Tominaga's bombers were over the target. Despite fierce resistance from anti-aircraft guns, the Japanese pressed home their attack with devastating effect. Fuel tanks erupted in sheets of flame, barracks buildings collapsed under the weight of high-explosive bombs, and the airfield's runways cratered under the bombardment. Yet even as Midway burned, its defenders refused to yield. The atoll's guns continued firing, and its remaining aircraft prepared for takeoff despite the chaos. Tominaga circled overhead, assessing the damage through the smoke and flames. His radio crackled to life as he transmitted the message that would change everything. There is need for a second attack. The words reached Nagumo at 0700 hours, just as the Admiral was wrestling with his most crucial decision of the war. On the flight decks below, Japanese ground crews were frantically rearming the returning aircraft for a second strike on Midway. But Nagumo knew that American torpedo bombers from the atoll had already launched their attack against his fleet. The lumbering Devastator torpedo bombers and Flying Fortress heavy bombers posed little threat individually, but their presence meant that American forces were closer than anticipated. The Admiral's dilemma was compounded by standing orders from Yamamoto himself. Maintain half of his aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for use against American warships, should they appear. But Tominaga's urgent request for a second strike suggested that Midway's defenses remained dangerously intact. At 0715 hours, Nagumo made his fateful decision. He ordered his crews to rearm the second-wave aircraft with land attack bombs for another strike on Midway. The armor-piercing weapons were hastily removed from the Kate torpedo bombers and replaced with high-explosive bombs, while fuel lines snaked across the flight decks to top off the thirsty aircraft. Neither Nagumo nor his staff could have known that at that very moment, American dive bombers were already climbing toward their patrol altitude, their pilots scanning the horizon for the telltale smoke of the Japanese fleet. The die had been cast, and the greatest naval battle in Pacific history was about to begin. The morning of June 4, 1942, dawned clear and bright over the Pacific, the kind of perfect flying weather that carrier pilots dreamed of and prayed for. Aboard Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his radio headset and scanned the horizon through the canopy of his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber. As leader of Air Group 6, he carried the hopes of Task Force 16, and perhaps the entire Pacific Fleet in the bomb bay of his aircraft. At 0702 hours, the long-awaited message crackled through the radio static. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. A Catalina flying boat had finally spotted Nagumo's fleet, and within minutes, the American carriers erupted into controlled chaos as flight deck crews prepared for the largest airstrike they had ever launched. The attack would unfold in 3 waves, each more desperate than the last. First came Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, 15 obsolete Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers led by Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, a part Cherokee pilot whose fierce determination had earned him the respect of every man in his squadron. The Devastators were death traps, slow, poorly armed, and vulnerable to fighter attack, but they were all the Navy had. Waldron's aircraft found the Japanese fleet at 0920 hours, just as Nagumo's returning strike from Midway was beginning to land. The timing could not have been worse for the Americans. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, consisting of experienced Zero fighter pilots, fell upon the lumbering torpedo bombers like wolves on sheep. Within minutes, all 15 devastators had been shot down, their crews becoming martyrs to a cause they could barely comprehend. According to Walter Lord's definitive account in Incredible Victory, the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 became one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval aviation history. But Waldron's sacrifice was not in vain. The low-level torpedo attack had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches unguarded. At precisely 0:10:22 hours, as Nagumo's flight decks lay cluttered with rearming aircraft and fuel lines, Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best led 37 dauntless dive bombers into their attack dives from 14,000 feet. The scene below was a dive bomber pilot's dream. The 4 Japanese carriers steamed in formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for the planned second strike on Midway. Bombs, torpedoes, and aviation gasoline created a volatile mixture that needed only a spark to become an inferno. Best selected the nearest carrier, Akagi, flagship of the 1st Air Fleet and personal command of Admiral Nagumo. His Dauntless screamed downward at 70 degrees, the airspeed indicator climbing past 300 knots as anti-aircraft fire erupted around him like deadly flowers. At 1,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled. Out of his dive, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. The bomb struck Akagi near the aft elevator, penetrating deep into the hangar deck before exploding among the rearming aircraft. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited and torpedo warheads detonated. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a floating funeral pyre. Simultaneously, other dive bomber sections were attacking Kaga and Soryu with equally devastating results. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie's bombers from Yorktown joined the assault, their 1,000-pound bombs turning the Japanese carriers into blazing hulks. In the span of 6 minutes, 3 of Nagumo's 4 carriers had been effectively destroyed, their flight decks twisted wreckage and their hangars consuming infernos. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, watching in stunned disbelief as his magnificent fleet burned around him. The radio brought reports of catastrophe from every quarter. Kaga listing heavily to starboard, her magazines threatening to explode, Soryu dead in the water with uncontrollable fires, and only Hiryu remaining operational from his once mighty force. The Americans had achieved tactical surprise of the highest order, but the battle was far from over. Hiryu still flew the flag of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, and her flight decks remained intact. As smoke columns marked the funeral pyres of his sister ships, Yamaguchi prepared his counterstrike, knowing that Japan's honor, and perhaps her very survival depended upon the aircraft warming up on his flight deck. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of Hiryu, his weathered face set in grim determination as he surveyed the devastation surrounding his lone surviving carrier. The morning's catastrophe had transformed the combined fleet's moment of triumph into a tableau of maritime horror. To port, Akagi burned with such fierce intensity that her steel plates glowed cherry red in the afternoon sun. Kaga had already slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy, while Soryu drifted like a dying whale, her back broken by internal explosions. Yet Yamaguchi refused to accept defeat. Known throughout the Imperial Navy as one of its most aggressive commanders, he had earned his reputation in the crucible of combat from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. If Hiryu was to die this day, she would die fighting, taking as many Americans with her as possible. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters thundered off Hiryu's flight deck under the command of Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the American task force that had dealt such devastating blows to the mobile force, and Yamaguchi had armed them with a burning desire for revenge. The Japanese strike found Task Force 17 at 1320 hours. The Americans had been expecting retaliation, and Admiral Fletcher's ships bristled with anti-aircraft guns as the enemy formation approached. But the Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies, pressed home their attack with the skill born of years of training and months of combat experience. Yorktown became their primary target, her distinctive silhouette marking her as a fleet carrier worthy of their attention. The Val dive bombers screamed down through the defensive fire, their pilots holding steady despite the storm of steel erupting around them. 3 bombs struck home, one penetrating deep into the ship's vitals and exploding near the forward elevator. The carrier shuddered under the impact. Her flight operations temporarily halted as damage control parties fought to contain the spreading fires. Naval historian John Lundstrom noted in The First Team that Yorktown's damage control capabilities, honed through months of combat operations, proved superior to Japanese expectations. But the Americans had learned valuable lessons about damage control from their British allies, who had been fighting for their lives in the Mediterranean and North Atlantic. Within an hour, Yorktown's crew had the fires under control and the flight deck operational once again. By 1440 hours, she was launching and recovering aircraft as if nothing had happened. Yamaguchi was not finished. At 231 hours, he launched his final strike. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 60 fighters led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway. Tominaga's aircraft had been damaged during the earlier strike, its fuel tank punctured by anti-aircraft fire, but the young officer refused to stand down. He would lead this attack even knowing he lacked sufficient fuel to return. The second Japanese strike reached the American fleet at 245 hours, skimming low over the water as they approached Yorktown from multiple directions. The carriers, Wildcat fighters rose to meet them, but several of the nimble Kate torpedo bombers broke through the defensive screen. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on her port side, their explosions tearing massive holes in her hull and flooding her engine rooms. This time, the damage proved too severe for quick repair. Yorktown took on a dangerous list to port, her speed dropping to barely 6 knots as her engineering crews fought to maintain power. Admiral Fletcher, recognizing that his flagship had become a liability, transferred his flag to the heavy cruiser Astoria and ordered the carrier abandoned. Yet even as Yorktown lay dying, her sacrifice had served its purpose. The 2 Japanese strikes had expended Hiryu's remaining offensive capability, leaving Yamaguchi with only a handful of fighters for defense. The American carriers, meanwhile, remained largely intact and ready for action. At 3:03 hours, Enterprise launched her final strike of the day, 24 Dauntless dive bombers led by Lieutenant Wilmer Earl Gallagher. Their target was obvious. Hiryu steamed alone on the darkening ocean, her flight deck conspicuous in its isolation. The American dive bombers found their target at 5 o'clock in the evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the Pacific. As they began their attack dives, Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire desperately, but without fighter cover, the carrier was defenseless against the screaming Dauntlesses. 4 bombs struck home in rapid succession, turning Hiryu's flight deck into a twisted mass of steel and flame. Admiral Yamaguchi, standing on his bridge as the fires consumed his ship, made the decision that would define his legacy. Rather than abandon ship, he chose to go down with Hiryu, sharing the fate of the carrier that had served as his home and his weapon. As darkness settled over the Pacific on the evening of June 4, 1942, the magnitude of the disaster began to crystallize in the mind of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. From his flagship Yamato, positioned 300 miles to the west with the main force, he received reports that read like a catalog of maritime catastrophe. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, their experienced air crews dead or scattered, and with them the instrument of Japanese naval dominance that had swept across the Pacific for 6 months. The architect of Pearl Harbor sat in his cabin, studying the dispatch logs that told the story of his greatest defeat. Akagi, his former flagship and the symbol of Japanese naval aviation, had finally succumbed to her wounds at 4:05 in the morning of June 5th, sliding beneath the waves with a death rattle of escaping air and exploding ammunition. Kaga had preceded her into the depths by several hours, while Soryu and Hiryu would follow before the sun reached its zenith. Yamamoto faced a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The surface forces under his command still possessed overwhelming superiority over the Americans. 11 battleships, 13 heavy cruisers, and dozens of destroyers remained intact and ready for action. A night engagement might yet salvage something from the wreckage of Operation MI, perhaps even achieving the decisive battle he had sought since the war's beginning. But what purpose would such a victory serve now, Without air cover, his magnificent battleships would become targets for American land-based bombers from Midway and Hawaii. The loss of his carriers had not merely cost him ships, it had cost him the ability to project power across the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. According to Yamamoto's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, whose diary was later published as Fading Victory, the admiral spent the night of June 4th walking the deck of Yamato, wrestling with the implications of his defeat. At 02:55 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that effectively ended Japanese hopes for decisive victory in the Pacific. Operation MI is cancelled. All forces will withdraw to the west. The message rippled through the combined fleet like a funeral bell, carrying with it the death of Japanese naval supremacy and the birth of American ascendancy in the Pacific War. But the Americans were not finished with their enemies. As dawn broke on June 5th, search planes from Enterprise and Hornet ranged far to the west, hunting for the retreating Japanese fleet. They found their quarry in the form of the heavy cruisers Mikuma and Mogami, which had collided during the confusion of the night withdrawal and now limped westward, trailing oil and listing heavily. The final act of the Battle of Midway unfolded with brutal efficiency. Wave after wave of American dive bombers descended upon the crippled cruisers, their 1,000-pound bombs turning the once proud warships into blazing wrecks. Mikuma capsized and sank at 1315 hours, taking most of her crew with her into the depths. Mogami, though heavily damaged, managed to escape under cover of her escorting destroyers, but she would never again pose a threat to American forces. Meanwhile, the drama of Yorktown's fate continued to unfold in waters northeast of Midway. The abandoned carrier, her wounds sealed by heroic damage control efforts, had remained afloat through the night of June 4th. At dawn on June 5th, a salvage party led by her commanding officer, Captain Elliot Buckmaster, reboarded the vessel in an attempt to save her. For nearly 2 days, the salvage crews worked frantically to restore power and reduce the carrier's list. Their efforts seemed on the verge of success when disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. The Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the damaged carrier since the previous evening. At 1:36 hours on June 6th, Tanabe fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the stationary target. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown, delivering the death blow that American bombs had failed to achieve. The carrier, veteran of the Coral Sea and Midway, finally succumbed to her wounds at 05:01 hours on June 7th, taking with her the distinction of being the only American fleet carrier lost during the battle. Yet even in death, Yorktown's sacrifice seemed to underscore the transformation that had occurred during those 4 fateful days in June. The Americans had entered the battle as underdogs, their fleet outnumbered and outgunned by the veteran forces of the Imperial Navy. They emerged as masters of the Pacific, their victory so complete that Japan would never again possess the strength to threaten American territory. The reckoning was not merely numerical, though the statistics told their own story. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed against 1 American, over 3,000 Japanese casualties compared to fewer than 400 American dead. More profound was the psychological transformation that had occurred on both sides of the Pacific. The morning sun of June 7, 1942, rose over a Pacific Ocean forever changed by 4 days of thunder and flame. As the last smoke, columns from burning ships dissipated into the tropical sky. Both victor and vanquished began to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired in the waters surrounding a tiny coral atoll that few Americans could have located on a map just a week earlier. In Tokyo, the news of the disaster at Midway struck the Imperial Navy's leadership like a physical blow. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, sat in stunned silence as casualty reports flowed into Navy headquarters. The numbers told a story of catastrophe beyond imagination. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, 248 aircraft lost, and over 3,000 experienced naval personnel dead or missing. Among the fallen were some of Japan's most skilled aviators, irreplaceable veterans who had honed their skills in the crucible of combat from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. The human cost, however, represented only part of the strategic disaster. Japan's carrier aviation capability, built painstakingly over 2 decades and perfected in the opening months of the Pacific War, had been effectively destroyed in a single afternoon. The mobile force that had struck Pearl Harbor and rampaged across the Pacific for 6 months ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the defeat in the hushed tones reserved for bearing terrible news to divine authority, reportedly received the reports in silence before dismissing his naval aid with a single word: regrettable. The understatement concealed a truth that Japan's leaders were only beginning to grasp. The initiative in the Pacific War had permanently shifted to their enemies. Military historian John Keegan observed in the Second World War that Midway represented the most decisive naval engagement since Trafalgar, fundamentally altering the strategic balance in the Pacific theater. For Admiral Chester Nimitz and his subordinate commanders, victory brought both elation and sobering recognition of the challenges that lay ahead. The Japanese defeat at Midway had eliminated their ability to conduct major offensive operations, but the Empire still controlled a vast arc of territory stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. Dislodging entrenched Japanese forces from their island strongholds would require a sustained campaign of unprecedented scale and complexity. Yet the psychological impact of Midway resonated far beyond the realm of military strategy. In American factories, workers who had labored under the shadow of defeat since Pearl Harbor now bent to their tasks with renewed purpose. The arsenal of democracy that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had envisioned began to reach full production capacity, turning out ships, aircraft, and weapons at a rate that would soon dwarf Japanese industrial capability. The battle's most profound legacy, however, lay in its demonstration of American adaptability and technological superiority. The code-breaking triumph that had made victory possible showcased American intelligence capabilities that would prove decisive throughout the remainder of the war. The performance of American pilots, many flying combat missions for the first time, proved that training and determination could overcome experience when combined with superior equipment and tactical intelligence. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, whose 1,000-pound bomb had delivered the death blow to Akagi, returned to Pearl Harbor as a hero, but also as a man forever changed by what he had witnessed. In later years, he would reflect on the moment when his bomb struck the Japanese flagship. "I didn't think about the men below decks or the families they would never see again. In that moment, there was only the target and the mission. But afterward, in the quiet hours, you realize that victory and tragedy are often separated by the thickness of a bomb's casing." The strategic ramifications of Midway continued to unfold throughout the summer and autumn of 1942. Japanese forces, deprived of carrier support, found themselves increasingly isolated on their island bastions. The Americans, emboldened by their success, launched their first major offensive operation at Guadalcanal in August, beginning the long, bloody campaign that would eventually carry them to Tokyo Bay. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and prophet of Japan's naval destiny, never recovered from the defeat at Midway. His prescient warning that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year had proven tragically accurate. The mobile force that he had crafted into the world's most formidable naval striking arm lay scattered across the Pacific floor, taking, with it, Japan's hopes for decisive victory. As the years passed and the Pacific War ground toward its inevitable conclusion, historians would debate the precise moment when Japan's defeat became inevitable. Some would point to Pearl Harbor's failure to destroy America's aircraft carriers, others to the industrial mobilization that followed. But many would argue that the true turning point came during those 4 days in June 1942, when 2 great naval powers collided in the blue waters surrounding Midway Atoll, and the course of the Pacific War was decided by the skill, courage, and sacrifice of aviators who fought and died far from home. The thunder of that fateful encounter would echo through history, a reminder that in war, as in life, destiny often hangs upon moments measured not in years or months, but in the brief span of time it takes for a bomb to fall from 14,000 feet to a carrier's flight deck below.